Welcome to the Finance Magnates Blockchain Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel McIntosh, and recently we spoke to Bartek Ringwelski, COO of bitFlyer, about how the exchange is working to stay ahead of the shifting regulatory landscape around the world. So Bartek, let's get started here. Can you just start by telling our listeners what bitFlyer is?
Yeah, so bitFlyer is a global Bitcoin exchange and virtual currency exchange, as well as a blockchain R&D company. So we're based, headquartered in Tokyo. I run the U.S. office out of San Francisco, which we opened about a year or so ago, and we launched in the U.S. officially at the end of November. But a bit of background on the company. Started in 2014 by two Goldman Sachs alumni who are both software developers and traders. And in the 4 years since that founding, have grown bitFlyer into the largest virtual currency exchange in the world. Mm-hmm. And then we launched in the U.S. back in November. And then Europe, actually, bitFlyer Europe launched in January of this year.
That's right. And how did you get involved with bitFlyer?
So for me, I've always been very interested in the intersection of finance and technology, and I've also always been interested in marketplaces. So I had worked in the sharing economy space. So I had worked at TaskRabbit, which is a marketplace for local services. Mm-hmm. And then I had also worked in a peer-to-peer lending company called Lending Club. And what was interesting to me about the cryptocurrency space was that it is, obviously a combination of finance and technology, and it's a marketplace. But it's also just so incredibly innovative. It's rare to see something that kind of comes and sort of defines its own category. When I was working at Lending Club, which is a peer-to-peer lending company, finding innovation in a space like lending is actually kind of difficult because the concept of lending has existed for 3,000 years. And a lot of things have already been tried. In a space like the virtual currency space, it's such a greenfield opportunity that there'll be a lot of things that don't work, but there will be a lot of things that are formed in the first, handful of years that end up defining the entire industry for the next, several decades. And I thought that was just a really exciting place to be.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique opportunity. If I'm a trader and I'm looking for an exchange, why would I choose bitFlyer, both as an individual and maybe as an institutional investor?
Sure, yeah. So bitFlyer is one of the most professional exchanges that are out there. Right now we launched with Bitcoin to USB trading. We have licensures in 44 states, so it's broadly accessible. Mm-hmm. And very shortly, we're going to be linking the U.S. exchange with our Japanese exchange, which is going to be really powerful for our trading community because it allows finally U.S. traders to have access to Japanese liquidity. Mm-hmm. And just as a bit of background for people who may not know, Japan is really the epicenter of Bitcoin trading activity. More than 50% of all Bitcoin trading happens out of Japan, and bitFlyer owns about 70% of the Bitcoin trading market share in Japan. So by linking our order books with Japan, U.S. residents will have unprecedented levels of liquidity and order book depth that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get without bitFlyer. So that's one. The second piece is, and I'm still very much talking on sort of the institutional side, the second piece is the actual tools that we have, I think are probably some of the most advanced in the professional trading community. So we track Delta, we track daily P&L. We can create sort of chained conditional orders that otherwise would require an API through our web interface. Of course, we also have an API. So that's sort of on the the professional trading community. Also, currently we have 0 fees during our promotional period. And then as we expand this year, we're going more into consumer, and we'll have sort of products that make it easier for people who aren't as professional to enter the Bitcoin and virtual currency space.
I see. And so you just mentioned there the promotional period. So can you tell me why you're currently in a promotional period?
Well, yeah, as a new exchange, we want to attract people to try us out. And by having a no-fee trading period, it really removes a lot of the barriers that people may have. It also allows us to understand what our customer behaviors are and what seems like incentivizes people to join and be active on our platform.
Okay, and so just out of curiosity, how long will that period last?
So it's currently running through the end of March.
Oh, okay, great. And then, a couple minutes ago, you mentioned that bitFlyer is licensed in 44 U.S. states. So can you tell me what kind of licensure it has, seeing as, there isn't really, in most states, an official exchange license?
Yeah. So we have money transmitter licenses, which is kind of the licensure that would allow us to operate our business in states that view crypto exchanges as a money transmitting business. There are some states also that don't view us that way, and in which case they're effectively called no-action states. But between the no-action states as well as states where they view us as money transmitters, including districts, we're at 44 states.
Okay.
That process, I would say, is quite a long and lengthy process, and there's really high barriers to entry to get to that because every state has its own rules and regulations. One of the states that we have, which is we're really excited about, is New York, which has the New York Bit license, and we got that actually on the day that we launched the service.
Fantastic. So speaking of regulations, the regulatory climate in the United States is changing right now pretty rapidly. So what is bitFlyer doing to ensure that it's staying abreast and even ahead of regulations and keeping compliant?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we've done in Japan that has been really successful is being really proactive with interacting with regulators. And that's a very similar stance that we're taking in the U.S. So, for example, even though we launched in November, for the year prior to that, we started already down the path of acquiring licenses, which, may actually not be a sort of a typical approach. I think a lot of other companies would have started with, let's say, launching in the no-action states and then slowly gaining sort of approval as they expand. But what we wanted to do is really understand the overall regulatory ecosystem before operations so that we would understand who are the different stakeholders and that we would build a platform in such a way that we think would be sort of most compliant. So one, I would say, just the stance that we've taken has always been very compliance and regulatory focused because our viewpoint is that this space, it's no surprise that the space is getting more and more attention from regulators as it becomes a larger market. The second piece is that we are thinking about how do we self-regulate. And so there was a couple of proposals recently for self-regulation amongst this industry, and I think that's a very interesting angle for proactively engaging with other players in the space who we think are doing things the right way and gives regulators a point of interface to ask questions and to interface versus, without that, it's kind of a free-for-all of different regulatory bodies wondering whether they should, what part of the ecosystem that they should sort of own. And so I think the more proactive the overall industry is and the more proactive bitFlyer is, the more protection consumers have and the more sort of safety and regulators overall will have a point of contact where they can sleep at night as well.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned briefly that you've been working as well. Well, the Japanese branch of bitFlyer has been working with regulators over there. Do you foresee any sort of crackdown by the Japanese government following, the CoinCheck hack and a lot of these other high-profile hacks that have come in the last few months? And if so, how do you think that Japanese regulation in general will affect bitFlyer, or will it?
Yeah, I would say that they're not so much cracking down in Japan as they're becoming more vigilant. So I think there's, so as a bit of background, Japan has created what I understand to be the first sort of virtual currency license. And it was issued by the FSA, which is the governing body. And following the CoinCheck hack, I think that the FSA has sort of re-examined a lot of the participants who've been given licenses, as well as those who are applying for licenses, and making sure that their standards are sort of up to snuff. And in some of those cases, I think that they've asked participants to sort of strengthen certain areas of weaknesses. But for the silver lining for an event like CoinCheck is that it increases scrutiny, it increases security, and ultimately I think that benefits the industry. And in a lot of ways, that's why Japan is on the forefront of sort of the regulatory oversight, is because Mt. Gox happened in Japan. And as a result, regulators were forced to deal with a lot of the things that regulators outside of Japan are now sort of either dealing with or worried about. And so every time that an event like this happens, there's increased regulatory scrutiny, but the silver lining is that consumers are better protected as a result of that increased scrutiny. And bitFlyer's position has always been to really embrace that regulation, and in a lot of ways help shape that regulation. So our founder, Yuzo Kano, was the chairman of the board of the Japan Blockchain Association that worked really closely with the FSA to form the virtual currency laws. And so that's kind of our viewpoint, right? As the market evolves, we want to be working really closely with regulators to sort of overall increase the trust that consumers have in the platform. And every time there's an event, that's an opportunity for us to understand what went wrong, and then to strengthen the sort of security measures to sort of reduce that risk again in the future.
So speaking of security measures, what is specifically is bitFlyer doing to stay on the cutting edge of security?
And so, I'll have to give a bit of a vague answer to this because the security measures themselves are proprietary, and sharing too much information about those will potentially compromise some of those. But what I would sort of share to give comfort is the way that we're able to get licensures like the virtual currency license in Japan, the nature of us being on the board of the Japan Blockchain Association, and then having the licensures that we have in the U.S., especially New York, all of that has and I should also add, having the national license to cover Europe, all of those licensure processes require a really in-depth security review. And so we've sort of disclosed those security measures to the regulators, and those have made them comfortable. I think what I can generally say is we follow industry best practices, but I can't get into too many details. But security for us is sort of always top of mind, just given the nature of the industry that we're in, and events like CoinCheck. What happens in a scenario like CoinCheck is people get worried, and I think it increases overall focus on security, and that's kind of always a good thing for the industry in the long term.
That's true. So as you mentioned, in late January, bitFlyer opened a European platform. So in terms of numbers, what kind of expansion has bitFlyer experienced since then?
Well, I guess I can't get too much into numbers. I can talk about strategy.
Okay.
When bitFlyer was formed in Japan, the viewpoint was always to create a global exchange, and that's not really possible to do if you're only headquartered in Japan. And so the U.S. was sort of the first foray into an international expansion, but like close after that came Europe, and between Europe, Asia, and the U.S., we think we have like a really sort of solid triad of sort of offices from which we can start creating what's really a global trading platform. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that by linking those together, you can start linking people to trade with each other who are in very different geographic parts of the world. So one thing that we're working on now, and that we'll be releasing in the near term, is to have the ability for U.S. residents and users of bitFlyer to trade with our Japan bitFlyer users. And down the road, that'll also be the case for Europe and Japan and Europe and the USA. And so the way I think we sort of think about sort of like numbers and activities sort of from a global perspective, because ultimately all of those boards will be linked together.
I see. So, if bitFlyer's goal is to become a global cryptocurrency exchange, can you give any details as to what's next in terms of expansion?
Yeah. So there's going to be new currency pairs that we're going to be adding to our Lightning platform. Mm-hmm. Right now, it's only Lightning is our professional product. So currently, it's only Bitcoin USD, and in Europe, it's Bitcoin EUR.
Okay.
So in the coming weeks and months, we're going to be adding new pairs that are going to be global in nature. So they'll be the same board that Japan uses or Europe uses. And then we're also going to be adding more consumer-oriented features, because what we found is that while we provide a professional platform, a lot of people who are joining are not quite there yet from a sort of like hardcore trader perspective, and they're looking to dip their toes into sort of the overall virtual currency space. And so we're going to be providing features that let them buy and sell virtual currencies in addition to Bitcoin in a way that's easier than sort of like a traditional order book perspective. And then, sort of related things to that to make it accessible for consumers. And so you should see that in the next coming months being released. And we're really excited about it.
Yeah, can you just briefly explain a little bit more about what the Lightning platform is?
Yeah, so Lightning is our professional trading platform where users can place market orders, limit orders, as well as sort of special orders that combine various conditional statements. It's also the platform where users can use our API to trade on the platform algorithmically.
I see. Okay. So recently, Binance announced the launch of a decentralized exchange that will list almost any token. Does bitFlyer have any similar plans on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question here comes back to a compliance question, because when you start listing every token that exists in theory, it exposes the consumers of that service to a lot of risk. And so when we look at what coins we offer on our platform and what currencies we offer on our platform, there's really multiple layers that it has to go through. From the business side, we want to make sure that our customers are protected and that that we believe in sort of the long-term validity of that coin. But then there's also the regulatory side. We also have to convince our regulators, both in Japan, Europe, and the U.S., that coin has merit. Mm-hmm. And between those two different sort of levels of filters, we won't have, let's say, as many coins as maybe Binance in a world where they're decentralized and anything can be listed. But you'll have the safety and security of knowing that it's gone through a lot of sort of checks and balances. The challenge with a Binance model is that it exposes consumers to potentially a lot of risk. And given that what we've chosen to do is to play the long game and working very closely with regulators, that model of sort of a free-for-all would be quite difficult for us to do. The other factor is we are an onboard ramp or sort of on-ramp for people entering the crypto space, because you can exchange fiat for Bitcoin or fiat for other virtual currencies, whereas places like Binance, don't do that fiat to crypto.
And bitFlyer does.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I'm, just the average user who's looking to become a user on Binance, what kind of KYC requirements do I have to go through?
It's a good question. I'm actually not too familiar with the KYC requirements of crypto to crypto exchanges. In general, the requirements are lower because they're less regulated. It's more of a gray area, right? Like in our case, someone's physically sending money from a U.S. bank account, and then we're exchanging that, or they're using that to purchase Bitcoin. What we have to show regulators is that that person who sent us those funds has, passed the OFAC check, that we, have their basic information, and as the limits of daily trading go up, we have to provide more and more information. That, I think, becomes really important when you're dealing with fiat to USD. Once you start doing crypto to crypto, it's a gray area, right? Like at some point, your tether had been converted from US dollars, but they're able to operate in a much more gray area. Where that ends up going sort of remains to be seen. But we think the long-term game is that we're going to stop talking about crypto exchanges as crypto exchanges and more just talking about the net exchanges. And they're going to blend together crypto as well as equities as well as other things in a way that sort of feels less like a dichotomy of two different competing things. And we'll be talking to them more about like one form of sort of general trading.
Right. So does bitFlyer have plans to become, not just a crypto exchange? Well, I guess maybe a better way to say that is like you mentioned, an exchange where digital currencies are traded as well as assets and maybe stocks and these kinds of things.
I don't think we have anything sort of publicly stated in that world, but I would say that's generally the industry. If I were to think about where does the industry move in 5 to 10 years, I'd be surprised if we still are calling it a crypto exchange.
Yeah, okay. I see. So switching gears a little bit, way back in September and late August when China announced the sweeping set of bans for cryptocurrency, how did bitFlyers, along with all the other exchanges, but specifically with bitFlyer, how did the exodus from China affect the company as a whole?
Yeah, it's funny. It created a lot of opportunity for us because those investors and those traders were looking for a new place to trade. So I think that what we experienced in Japan was an increase of customers coming from those markets. I think from a business perspective, it ended up helping us. I think we always want to see the crypto sort of ecosystem to be embraced. Like in the long term, I think it's beneficial for countries to have regulation and for countries to have healthy markets in their space. And, in the short term, we saw an increase of customers who are just looking for a place to trade. But I think, one of the interesting things about this space is that there are bans, but sometimes those bans are actually more like pauses while regulators in those countries are figuring out what to do. And Japan had faced a lot of these questions a lot earlier than everyone else because of the Mt. Gox incident, which kind of gives Japan this sort of head start. But I wouldn't be surprised if countries that have banned cryptocurrency exchanges, at some point bring them back in under a heavier set of regulation. It's in a lot of ways, I think it just sort of has surprised them how active they've become, and then then they don't truly feel comfortable with them at that time. But I'd imagine that a lot of them end up sort of coming back into play at some point in the future.
So you think that might be the case with China?
Yeah, I mean, there are rumors that China is looking to launch its own, government-sponsored exchange, and that could possibly be the case. The fascinating thing about Bitcoin and virtual currencies is that their nature of being decentralized means you're not really ever blocking. You're not ever shutting them down. You're just blocking access to them, or attempting to, and it has a way of sort of staying present even if you don't want it to be there, right? There's a lot of analogies between the internet and blockchain, and there are countries that could theoretically block the internet, but at some point that probably goes away and it's accessible again.
Right. Can you just tell us, a little bit more specifically, what bitFlyer has on the roadmap for this next year?
Yeah, so the big factor for us is we want to go deeper into the two segments that I mentioned. So one is the product we have now, which is our Lightning trading platform. So we're going to be adding more currency pairs to that platform. Currently, we only have Bitcoin and USD. That's going to give our users a broader set of trading options. And then we're going to link the boards together internationally. And then that's going to create a lot of market liquidity that doesn't exist today, really in any market. That's going to be a really exciting set of changes that are going to happen in the next couple of months. And then in addition to that, we're going to start making it a lot easier for our consumers who are less professional to be able to enter the virtual currency space, both through sort of Bitcoin as well as other altcoins in a much easier interface than like a trading platform interface. So they'll be able to buy and sell, let's say, Bitcoin, as easily as they would be buying something from Amazon. And in addition to that, we're going to increase our funding options. Currently, we only offer Wire, which is great for professionals, but is a bit expensive and intimidating for consumers. So we're going to be adding easier ways to fund the purchase of smaller fractions of Bitcoin. So what we're really excited about is we're both increasing the depth of our professional offering as well as creating a brand new offering focusing on consumers. And if you look in Japan, those offerings are really, really popular. For example, our mobile app in Japan has 50,000 reviews, and it's a 4+ star rated app. And so bringing over these types of consumer features to the U.S., I think, is going to be a really exciting way to give consumers alternatives to the existing players.
All right. Well, Bartek, that's actually all the questions that I have. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we close this interview?
I just appreciate the time, and I think everyone here in bitFlyer USA is really excited about bridging this, what's going on in Japan and bringing sort of the best products from there to the U.S. audience. And you guys should be able to see the fruits of those efforts in the coming months.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Bartek, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Appreciate the time, and looking forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, take care.